Britain's Princess Margaret shattered tradition to marry a commoner, Anthony Armstrong-Jones.
Where people sometimes dispute, well, were Margaret and Tony really in love? The answer is yes, they were. But it was love that blinded them both.
3 years old. Her name is Elizabeth too. One day, that older sister will become queen. This younger daughter will become something else entirely, the sister standing just behind the throne, close enough to see everything, never quite close enough to hold it herself. They named her Margaret Rose. She turned 23 this week. And almost nobody noticed. No headlines. No trending hashtag. No photographers waiting outside a London townhouse. Just another quiet Wednesday in May, the kind of day that comes and goes without the world stopping to look. But I stopped. I looked. And what I found changed the way I understand this family forever. Her name is Lady Margarita Armstrong-Jones. And she is not who you think she is. You know the royal family the way most people know it.
And you helped Helena Bonham Carter, who was playing Princess Margaret, you helped her to just get the essence of the princess.
Yes, well, Helena rang me up, and I knew Helena. She's a relation of my husband, and she said, "Can I come and see you? Because I'm playing Princess Margaret, and I want to ask you some questions about her." And she came and had tea. She spent about 3 hours with me, and what she really wanted to know was how Princess Margaret walked and sat, and how she smoked, and things like that. And I did say to her, "Do you know, the most extraordinary thing is I've never ever seen Princess Margaret run."
William and Kate, endlessly photographed. Harry and Meghan, endlessly discussed. A cast of characters so familiar you could probably sketch their faces from memory. But there is another branch of this family. A quieter one. A branch that grew from love, from scandal, from heartbreak, and from a woman named Princess Margaret, a woman the world remembers as glamorous and tragic and gone. Margaret died in February of 2002. Just 3 months later, in May, a baby girl was born into the family she left behind. That baby never met her grandmother. Not once. Not for a single day. And yet, somehow, she carries her forward. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A woman spends her entire life defined by a choice she was never truly free to make. And then she dies. And 3 months later, a child arrives who will spend her own life shaped by everything that woman went through, without ever getting to ask her a single question about it. That's not a footnote. That's not a minor royal nobody needs to know about. That's the quiet, unfinished sentence of Princess Margaret's life, still being written by someone else.
How aware were you then, as a teenager, that history was being made? Did it occur to you at the time?
I think it was just a terrific relief. All this horror was over.
Here's what almost nobody in the royal watching world seems to understand. While cameras chase the Cambridge down every street in London, while entire news cycles are built around Sussex drama, there is a granddaughter of a real princess, royal blood, direct line, unmistakable, living a life so private that most people don't know her name exists. I want to ask you something, and I want you to actually answer it in the comments below, because I read every single one. Have you ever felt invisible in your own family, like everyone was watching the one relative who caused all the drama, while you quietly held everything together in the background? Tell me yes or no. I want to know. Because that, in a strange and very real way, is Margarita's inheritance. Let's go back. Not to her. Not yet. To the woman who made her possible. August 21st, 1930. Glamis Castle, Scotland. A baby girl is born to the Duke and Duchess of York, the future King George VI and his wife, Elizabeth. Her older sister is already 3 years old. Her name is Elizabeth too. One day, that older sister will become queen. This younger daughter will become something else entirely, the sister standing just behind the throne, close enough to see everything, never quite close enough to hold it herself. They named her Margaret Rose. From the beginning, she was the other one. The spare. the sister who got to be interesting because she didn't have to be careful. While Elizabeth was groomed, quietly and relentlessly, for a crown she would wear for 70 years, Margaret was allowed, almost required, to be something looser. Funnier. Wilder. The palace could survive a wayward second daughter. It could not survive a wayward queen. So Margaret became glamorous. She became magnetic. She smoked, she performed at parties, she surrounded herself with actors and photographers and artists in a way no working royal before her ever had. And then, in her early 20s, she fell in love with the wrong man. His name was Peter Townsend, a decorated Royal Air Force officer, a war hero, a man who had served this family loyally for years as an equerry. He was also 16 years older than Margaret, and he was divorced. In the Britain of the 1950s, that single fact, divorced, was enough to end everything. The Church of England did not recognize divorce. The government would not support the marriage. And Margaret, 25 years old and deeply in love, was told, in essence, that she could have him or she could keep her royal life. Not both. Picture that choice for a moment. Not as a headline. As a real decision made by a real young woman in a real room with real people waiting on her answer. She chose duty. In October of 1955, Margaret issued a public statement renouncing any plan to marry Peter Townsend. She wrote that she had been aware that, by a church-recognized marriage, she could have kept her rights of succession, but that mindful of the Church's teaching that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of her duty to the Commonwealth, she had decided to put these considerations before any others. Duty before love. That was the sentence that defined her entire life. And here is where it gets worse. Because that sacrifice didn't buy her the peace anyone expected. It didn't earn her a quiet, settled happiness as a reward for doing the right thing. Instead, Margaret spent the following years restless. Searching. Photographed at parties long past midnight, linked to a rotating cast of the era's most famous faces, living, by every account, like a woman trying to outrun a decision she couldn't undo. 5 years later, in 1960, she married a photographer named Anthony Armstrong-Jones. He was talented. He was strikingly handsome. And he was, by the rigid standards of 1960s royal life, an outsider. Not aristocracy. Not military. A working artist who photographed actresses and musicians for a living, a man who moved through London's creative underground long before he ever set foot in a palace. It was called, at the time, a thoroughly modern royal marriage. The papers loved it. The public was fascinated by it. Anthony was made the first Earl of Snowdon in 1961. And for a while, just for a while, it looked like Margaret had built something real. Something that might finally be entirely her own. She hadn't. Their marriage produced 2 children. A son, David, born in 1961. A daughter, Sarah, born in 1964. And underneath the surface of a fashionable, photogenic royal household, something was quietly coming apart. I'm not going to walk you through every detail of that unraveling right now. That's a story for later in this series, and it deserves the space to be told properly. But I will tell you this. In 1976, Princess Margaret and Lord Snowdon separated. In 1978, they divorced. It was the first major divorce inside the immediate royal family in the modern era. Sit with that for a second. The very thing Margaret had sacrificed her own love to avoid scandalizing, divorce, ended up defining her marriage anyway. She gave up Peter Townsend to protect an institution from the appearance of a broken royal marriage. 2 decades later, she was standing in the middle of one. There is something almost unbearably human in that irony. Something that no palace statement could ever quite capture. Margaret spent her remaining years navigating a life that was neither fully private nor fully royal. She had duties, but no king's crown to make sense of them. She had fame, but increasingly little of the freedom that fame is supposed to buy. Friends described her, in later life, as brilliant, sharp, and often lonely, a woman capable of lighting up any room she walked into, who nonetheless spent a great deal of her life feeling like she was standing just outside the one room she actually wanted to be in.
She was all, when I was thinking back, I mean, Princess Margaret was very measured. And I think the reason we can see her going around now was that people always wanted to see her. And so she never hurried. So she gave people the opportunity to see her. But funnily enough, when I was talking to Helena, I just felt Princess Margaret was there, sort of listening to me, saying, "Come on, Anne, are you sure you're saying the right things about me?"
She died on the 9th of February, 2002, at the age of 71, after suffering a series of strokes. She was the first child of a monarch to die since her own father, King George VI, nearly 50 years earlier. The nation mourned her. The palace held a funeral. And then, as these things go, the world moved on to the next story. But something else was happening at exactly that moment. Something the headlines of February 2002 had no way of knowing. Because just 3 months later, May 14, 2002, a little girl was born into the family Margaret left behind. Her name was Margarita. And here is the detail that stops me every single time I think about this story. She never met her grandmother. Not for one single hour of her life. The woman whose choices, whose sacrifices, whose entire complicated legacy she was born to inherit was already gone before Margarita ever opened her eyes. What do you do with an inheritance like that? What do you do with a legacy you can only ever learn about secondhand? Through family stories, through old photographs, through the careful, guarded silence of relatives who watched that woman's life up close and decided, quietly, to build something different with the children who came after her? That question, I promise you, is the real story here. Not scandal. Not tragedy in the way you might expect. Something quieter, and in its own way, far more haunting. Because Margarita's father, David, watched his mother's entire life unfold from the closest possible distance. He watched what public scrutiny did to a woman who was brilliant and complicated and never quite given room to be both at once. And when it came time to raise his own children, he made choices that look almost like a direct answer to everything his mother went through. We are going to spend this series finding out exactly what those choices were. Who David Armstrong-Jones became after inheriting an earldom he never asked for. What kind of childhood he built for a daughter carrying his mother's name and her granddaughter's blood. Why Margarita, despite being closer to the throne than most people in this country will ever be to anyone in that family, has spent 23 years almost entirely unseen. And why, in boardrooms and drawing rooms most of us will never enter, there are now quiet conversations happening about whether that invisibility can last much longer. Before we go any further, I have another question for you, and I really do want an answer in the comments. If you had the chance to be famous, genuinely, royally famous, but it meant giving up your privacy for the rest of your life, would you take it? Just yes or no. I'll be reading through the answers. Here is what I can tell you right now, at the start of this story. Margarita was never styled as a princess. Under the modern conventions of what commentators call the slimmed-down monarchy, Princess Margaret's descendants were never granted the style of royal highness. With her father holding the Snowdon earldom, Margarita carries only the courtesy title of lady. Royal by blood. Private citizen by title. That contradiction is the exact center of everything that makes her story worth telling. Because somewhere in London right now, a 23-year-old woman with the blood of a princess in her veins is living a life almost nobody watches. She has built an education. She has built a quiet presence in circles far from any tabloid's lens. She has, by every account available to us, made a series of deliberate choices to live differently than the family members who came before her. And the further we go into this story, the more you're going to understand exactly why. Royal commentator Richard Fitzwilliams once observed that the quieter members of the extended royal family often go unappreciated, but that their discretion can serve the institution in ways public drama never could. I think he's right. But I think there's more to it than that. I think Margarita's silence isn't just discretion. I think it's inheritance. I think it's the one gift her family could actually give her, after everything Margaret never got to have for herself. Stay with me. Because in the next part of this story, we go back into that marriage, the modern, magnetic, ultimately shattered marriage between a princess and a photographer, and we uncover exactly what it cost the children who had to grow up inside it. And I promise you, what happens next reshapes everything you think you know about this family's quietest branch. Every family has a marriage that changes everything that comes after it. For the House of Windsor, that marriage began in a church in 1960, and it would end, quietly and painfully, 18 years later, leaving behind 2 children who spent the rest of their lives deciding what kind of family they wanted to build from the wreckage. I want to take you back there. Not to the wedding photographs you might have seen before. To the actual people standing behind them. May 6, 1960. Westminster Abbey. Princess Margaret, 29 years old, walks down the aisle to marry a man the palace establishment barely understood. His name was Anthony Armstrong-Jones. And on paper, he made no sense at all. He wasn't aristocracy. He wasn't military. He was a photographer, a working artist who spent his days in a rented studio in Pimlico, photographing actresses, musicians, and the restless young faces of a London that was just beginning to swing. He had built his reputation shooting for magazines, capturing exactly the kind of bohemian, unguarded energy that the royal family had spent centuries trying to keep at arm's length. And Margaret, the sister who had already sacrificed one love for duty, chose him anyway. Here's what nobody tells you about that wedding. It wasn't just a marriage. It was a message. A signal that the monarchy could, in fact, bend. That a princess could marry outside the old rules and the institution would survive it. The public adored it. The press called it the wedding of the decade. Anthony was given a title befitting a man about to spend his life beside a princess, the first Earl of Snowdon, created in 1961. For a moment, it looked like Margaret had built the thing she'd been denied 5 years earlier. A love the family accepted. A life entirely her own. She hadn't. Because underneath the photographs, underneath the magazine covers, something else was happening. 2 people who were both, in their own separate ways, used to being the most interesting person in any room, trying to build a marriage together. That rarely ends quietly. Their first child, David, was born on November 3, 1961, barely a year and a half after the wedding. Their daughter, Sarah, followed on May 1, 1964. And for a few years, from the outside at least, it looked like a fairy tale still holding together. Formal portraits. Royal tours. A young family photographed at the seaside, at garden parties, looking every bit the modern royal household the papers had promised. But children raised inside a marriage that is quietly falling apart learn to read a room long before anyone tells them the truth of what's happening in it. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it matters more than you might think for the rest of this story. Long before David Armstrong-Jones ever inherited an earldom, long before he became a father himself, he was a small boy learning to notice the silences in his own home. The tension that lived underneath the smiles in the photographs. The particular kind of quiet that settles over a house where 2 adults have stopped truly speaking to each other, even when they're standing in the same room. That's not something you read about in a court filing. That's something you carry. By the mid-1970s, the cracks had become impossible to hide. Margaret's marriage to Lord Snowdon had drifted into separate lives lived under something resembling the same roof. Separate friendships, separate holidays, separate versions of what their family was supposed to mean. In 1976, they formally separated. Here's a detail that rarely makes it into the shorter versions of this story. At the time, this wasn't just gossip column material. It was, in a very real sense, a national event. No senior member of the immediate royal family had separated in the modern era. The tabloids didn't just report on it. They treated it like a crack running through the entire foundation of the monarchy itself. 2 years later, in 1978, Margaret and Snowdon divorced. It was the first major divorce inside the immediate royal family since the reign began. Not a distant cousin. Not someone 3 or 4 branches removed. The monarch's own sister. I want you to think back to what I told you in the last part of this story. That Margaret had given up the one great love of her life, Peter Townsend, specifically because divorce was considered so scandalous, so institutionally dangerous, that marrying a divorced man was simply not allowed. And now here she was, divorced herself. That's not just irony. That's the kind of thing that reshapes how a person understands their own life. Every sacrifice she'd made in her 20s, the one everyone told her mattered so much, hadn't protected her from the very outcome she'd been asked to prevent. It had only delayed it. And it had cost her the one relationship that might have made her happy in the meantime. Now I want you to ask yourself something, and I want you to actually answer it in the comments below. If you'd given up the person you loved most to protect your family's reputation, and years later found yourself in the exact situation you sacrificed everything to avoid, would you feel like the sacrifice meant something? Or would it feel like it had all been for nothing? Just tell me, worth it or not? Because somewhere in that answer is exactly how David Armstrong-Jones grew up. He was 14 years old when his parents separated, 16 when the divorce was finalized, old enough to understand everything, young enough that it shaped him permanently. And here is where the story turns toward the man he actually became. Because David did not do what you might expect the son of a princess and an earl to do. He didn't chase royal life. He didn't build a public career off the family name. Instead, quietly, deliberately, he built something almost entirely separate from the palace world he'd been born into. He trained as a cabinet maker. Actual furniture making, a trade, learned with his hands, far from any ceremonial role the family might have expected of him. He later built a long professional career at Christie's, the auction house, working in fine art and design, building genuine expertise in a field that had nothing to do with royal duty and everything to do with the quiet, disciplined pursuit of a craft. This detail matters more than it might seem to on the surface. Because when his father, the first Earl of Snowdon, died in 2017, David inherited the earldom, becoming the second Earl of Snowdon. And by every account available to those who follow the family closely, he treated the title itself the way his mother once might have wished she could treat her own.
How did you go about it? Did you have any kind of plan?
Yes, I thought that one ought to have perhaps something of every category.
What's the first category? What's the first record?
Well, I suppose I thought back to my childhood, and that I thought of practically the first record that my sister and I used to play, most in Scotland.
Royal identity, as something that existed alongside his real life, not something that replaced it. He married Serena Stanhope in 1993. And together, they built a household that looks, from every angle available to us, almost like a direct answer to the marriage David himself grew up inside. 2 children. Charles, Viscount Linley, born in 1999. And Margarita, born May 14, 2002, just 3 months after her grandmother's death. I told you at the start of this series that Margarita never met Princess Margaret. Not once. But here's what I didn't tell you yet. She was raised by a father who met that woman's entire complicated life up close, the sacrifice, the glamour, the unraveling marriage, the divorce that shattered a royal precedent, and chose, deliberately, to build something quieter for his own children. That is not a small thing. That is a decision made every single day, in 1,000 small ways, by a man determined not to repeat the pattern he grew up inside. Here's the detail that stops me every time I think about this part of the story. Under the modern conventions that came to define what people now call the slimmed-down monarchy, Princess Margaret's descendants were never granted the style of Royal Highness. That decision wasn't an accident, and it wasn't an insult. It was a structural choice. One that placed David, and eventually his children, permanently outside the small circle of working royals who appear on the palace balcony, who carry out official engagements, who exist in the public record as instruments of the institution itself. David became, simply, the Earl of Snowdon. His children became, simply, Viscount Linley and Lady Margarita. Royal by blood. Ordinary by title. And as we're about to see, That gap between blood and title is exactly where Margarita's entire life has been quietly built. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something else, and again, I really do read every single comment, so don't just scroll past this one. Do you think a family that's been through public scandal and divorce owes it to the next generation to protect them from the spotlight completely? Or do you think that's actually running away from who they are? Just tell me. Protect them or let them face it? Because that exact question, whether to shield Margarita from public life entirely, or to let her find her own relationship with the family name, is the quiet argument sitting underneath everything that happens next in this story. David's own choices tell you almost everything about which side of that argument he came down on. Throughout his adult life, he has maintained a career almost entirely separate from royal duty. His work in art and design at Christie's built him a reputation among people who had no idea, and frankly didn't care, that he held a hereditary earldom. Colleagues described him as serious, precise, and genuinely skilled, a man who earned respect through the quality of his eye and his judgment, not through the accident of his birth. That is the exact inheritance he appears to have passed down to his children. Charles, the elder child and heir to the earldom, has largely stayed out of public view as well, building his own path, his own interests, his own life beyond the family name. And Margarita, the granddaughter of a princess who spent her entire life caught between duty and desire, has grown up inside a household that seems to have made peace with something Margaret herself never quite managed to secure. The idea that royal blood does not have to mean a royal life. That you can carry the name without carrying the weight the way your grandmother had to carry it. But here's the question that's about to take this story somewhere you don't expect. Because privacy, no matter how deliberately built, no matter how carefully protected by a family that learned its lessons the hard way, privacy is not the same as invisibility. And in the next part of this story, we're going to step into the actual rooms where Margarita has been seen. The events. The circles. The quiet, carefully chosen appearances that tell us more about who she has become than any official biography ever could. We're also going to look at something the family has never had to fully confront until now, a structural problem inside the monarchy itself, one that has nothing to do with scandal and everything to do with simple arithmetic. Fewer working royals. Hundreds of official engagements every single year. And a growing, unspoken question about who, exactly, is left to fill that gap when the current generation of senior royals can no longer carry it alone. Margarita is 23 years old. She has the bloodline. She has the composure. She has, by every account we're about to examine, exactly the kind of quiet credibility the institution may one day need. And I promise you, what we uncover next about where she's actually been seen and who has reportedly started paying attention to her will change the way you think about how much power a quiet, private life can actually hold. Stay with me. Because the next part of this story is where Margarita finally steps out of her grandmother's shadow and into a spotlight she never asked for, but may not be able to avoid forever. There is a version of this story where Margarita grows up exactly the way you'd expect. Photographed at 18. Splashed across a magazine spread at 21. A tabloid nickname by the time she can legally drink. That version exists for plenty of young royals. It simply never happened for her. And the more I dug into why, the more I realized that absence wasn't an accident. It was a decision. Made early. Made deliberately. Made by people who had watched, up close, what the alternative costs. Let me show you what that decision actually looked like in practice. Margarita's early education, by all accounts, was unremarkable in exactly the way her family seems to have wanted it to be. No royal correspondence camped outside the school gates. No breathless headlines about a princess's granddaughter starting term. She moved through her schooling the way any other well-off London child might, present, but unremarked upon. Invisible by design. She completed her secondary education with distinction, and went on to pursue higher education at a well-regarded British institution. Sources familiar with the family describe her as serious about her studies, methodical, the kind of student who did the reading before anyone had to ask her twice. I want you to pause on that for a second because it tells you something important. this is not a young woman who was coasting on a title. This is someone who built an actual academic foundation, brick by brick, the same slow and unglamorous way anyone else would have to. That's not what we usually hear about when we hear about young royals. And that's exactly the point. Compare that, for a moment, to the paths taken by Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, two young women only a little older than Margarita, both of whom spent their early 20s as near-permanent fixtures of the British tabloid press. Photographed at parties.
How aware were
Dissected
you
for their
then,
outfits,
as a teenager, that
followed
history
from
was being
nightclub to
made?
nightclub
Did it
by
occur to you-
photographers hungry for exactly the kind of unscripted moment that sells papers. Margarita's name essentially never appears in that same context. Why? Part of the answer, I think, goes back to something we uncovered in the last part of this story, a father who grew up watching the toll that kind of exposure took on his own mother, and who built an entirely different set of instincts as a result. But part of the answer is something else. Something more deliberate, and frankly, more modern. Because Margarita hasn't been absent from public life entirely. She has simply chosen where and how she appears. In recent years, according to those familiar with her circle, she has quietly built a presence in London's arts and culture world, attending gallery openings, design events, and cultural gatherings that rarely attract the same photographers who wait outside nightclubs. These are not the kinds of events built for maximum tabloid exposure. They are, if anything, built for almost the opposite. Rooms full of serious collectors, working artists, and cultural figures who have very little interest in chasing a royal headline. When she has been photographed at these events, the reaction from those around her has been consistent. Hello Magazine, covering one of her rare public appearances, described her as carrying herself with effortless poise. Composed, understated, entirely comfortable in rooms that would make plenty of 23-year-olds visibly nervous. I want you to sit with that word for a second. Poise. It's not a word people use to describe someone chasing attention. It's a word people use to describe someone who has never once needed to. There's a version of Margarita's grandmother in that description, if you look closely enough. Margaret was famous, in her own time, for a kind of magnetic elegance. A woman who could walk into any room and immediately become the most interesting person standing in it. But there's something else in Margarita's poise that seems to come from a different source entirely. Her grandfather, Anthony Armstrong-Jones, Lord Snowdon, was, whatever else history remembers about that marriage, a genuinely serious artist. A photographer with real technical skill and a real eye for design, someone who spent his life thinking carefully about how spaces, images, and objects communicate meaning. That sensibility appears to have skipped a generation and landed directly in his granddaughter. Those who've encountered her in London's design and culture circles describe someone with a real, informed appreciation for art and craftsmanship, not a passing interest, but something closer to inherited instinct. Her grandmother's elegance, her grandfather's eye, and her father's discipline. That combination, quietly assembled over 23 years, is not something you can manufacture with a publicist. It's something that gets built slowly, inside a household, long before anyone outside that household ever notices. And people are starting to notice. Here's a question I want you to actually answer in the comments, because I think the answer says a lot about how you were raised too. Do you think a quiet, private life is actually harder to build than a public one, because you have to constantly resist the pull toward attention, or do you think privacy is simply the easier, safer choice? Tell me which one you believe. Because here's what almost nobody talks about when it comes to families like this one. Choosing privacy isn't passive. It isn't simply the absence of a choice to be famous. It is, in its own way, a constant, ongoing decision. One that has to be made again and again, every time an opportunity for exposure presents itself and gets quietly declined instead. Margarita has apparently been making that decision, consistently, for 23 years. And that consistency is exactly what has started to draw a different, far more interesting kind of attention. Not tabloid attention. Institutional attention. Because here's the detail that changes the shape of this entire story, the one I promised you at the very beginning. According to those with knowledge of the extended royal family's inner conversations, there have been quiet, informal discussions in recent years about the role that Margarita's generation might one day play in supporting the monarchy's public work. I want to be careful with you here, because I think you deserve care rather than exaggeration. This is not a formal plan. There is no official announcement waiting in a drawer somewhere. Nobody has offered Margarita a working royal title, and nothing suggests that's imminent. But the conversation exists. And the reason it exists is almost entirely structural. The modern monarchy operates on a very simple, very unglamorous arithmetic. Several hundred official engagements happen every single year under the royal banner: hospital visits, military inspections, charitable patronages, ribbon cuttings, regimental duties, formal diplomatic functions. All of it requires actual people. Real human beings, showing up, representing the institution, doing the quiet, repetitive work that never makes headlines but keeps the entire machine running. And the number of senior royals available to do that work has been shrinking for years. Harry and Meghan stepped back in 2020. Prince Andrew withdrew from public duties in 2019 and gave up his working royal status entirely in 2022. The working core of the family has grown smaller and smaller, even as the institutional workload has stayed roughly the same. Which means somebody, eventually, has to fill that gap. Margarita is 23. She is composed, educated, and by every account already comfortable moving through exactly the kind of high-profile, high-scrutiny rooms that royal duty would require of her. She carries genuine royal blood, direct descent from a monarch's daughter. Even without the formal title that would traditionally announce that fact to the public. In other words, she may already have almost everything the institution would need from her. Except, perhaps, the willingness. And that, the open question of whether a young woman raised specifically to avoid the spotlight would ever choose to step directly into it, is exactly where this story is heading next. Because in the next part of this series, we're going to look closely at exactly what that shrinking pool of working royals actually means for the monarchy's future. We're going to examine what history tells us about minor royals who have stepped into larger public roles before, and what it cost them. And we're going to ask the question that the palace itself may not yet have an answer to. If the call ever comes for Margarita to step forward, will she answer it? Or will she do what her father did before her, and quietly choose a different life instead? Stay with me. Because what we uncover next about the pressures building inside this family may be the most important part of this entire story. Every institution eventually runs into the same problem. Not scandal. Not crisis. Just arithmetic. And right now, quietly, behind the palace walls, the British monarchy is running directly into it.